The Nabataeans built Petra in the desert of Jordan. They carved it from the cliffs, but their real achievement was water. They built an empire on water. They engineered a system in a barren canyon. They captured the desert's floods. They built a hidden network. They turned rock into a reservoir. These are precise engineering principles. They turned a canyon into a city. These principles speak to us now. They speak to scarcity. Their story is about resilience. We are just starting to understand it. It's about listening to the land. What does that mean, to listen to the land? Their story holds that secret. Southern Jordan is a landscape of absence. Rock and sky, water is a memory there, and it's also a threat. For most of the year, the sun bleaches the stone. The wadis, those dry riverbeds, they're silent. Empty, rainfall isn't just scarce. It's a fleeting event. It arrives in violent, concentrated bursts. A morning could be clear, and then a distant storm sends a wall of water roaring through the narrow canyons. It scours everything, then it vanishes, just as quickly as it came. That was the paradox the Nabataeans faced, a resource that was desperately needed and catastrophically destructive. How do you build a lasting civilization there? A city meant to thrive for centuries. You can't rely on luck. You have to master timing, capture, restraint. The canyon's walls made it defensible. They protected from armies, but those same walls trapped the sun's heat. They amplified the danger of the flash floods. Choosing this place was accepting a monumental engineering puzzle, a matter of sheer survival. The problem was clear. How do you transform a violent, sporadic deluge into a reliable, gentle stream? How do you take water that arrives all at once and convince it to stay, to be meted out slowly, over months of dry season, to sustain not just a village but a metropolis? Artisans, traders, families, appreciating that severity, that starting point, it's what makes their answer not just clever, it makes it visionary. They looked at this unforgiving landscape. And they didn't see a prison, they saw a vessel waiting to be properly tuned. They weren't city dwellers originally. Their roots were nomadic. They moved with herds across the northern Arabian desert, southern Jordan. Survival meant reading the land. It meant knowing where water might be found. They learned the signs, the discoloration of a rock, the way certain plants grew together. The shape of the ground, hinting at something underneath. That knowledge was passed down. It was intimate, practical. Their wealth came from a different kind of movement. The flow of goods, they became middlemen for the incense trade. Frankincense, myrrh, these resins came from southern Arabia. They had to travel north to Egypt, to Greece, to Rome. The Nabataeans controlled the overland paths through the desert. They knew where the hidden springs were. They could navigate the terrain. They protected the caravans. That trade brought immense wealth. It flowed into their tents, but wealth on the move is vulnerable. A nomadic power is fluid. The shift came when they decided to stop. They chose to anchor in one place, the canyon of Petra. That was the revolution. It meant moving from controlling the paths to water, to controlling the water itself. The trade capital gave them the means. The ambition created the necessity. To build a permanent capital, a city to announce their power, they had to solve the desert's paradox for good. Their nomadic knowledge was the blueprint, that innate understanding of water learned from chasing it. Now they'd apply it on a grand, stationary scale. They were adapting their strength, their dialogue with the land, to a monumental new challenge. The trade built their fortune, but mastering the terrain, mastering the water within it, that would cement their legacy. It reveals a society that didn't conquer the desert through force. It was a collaboration. They listened. Then they began to engineer what they'd heard. The sick is this split in the earth, a sandstone corridor. For the Nabataeans, though, its beauty wasn't the main thing. It was a narrow canyon, sometimes only 20 feet across. It was the city's main artery for people but also for water. It's a geological masterpiece shaped for collection. You have this high plateau around Petra. It's like a giant slanted roof. When it did rain, the water wouldn't soak in. It would sheet off the bare rock, gaining speed, heading for the lowest point. And that point was the entrance to the sick. The whole landscape was designed by nature to channel every drop into that one deep slot. The Nabataeans didn't build a catchment basin. They saw the one the desert had already made. They saw the sick as a funnel, a geological gift. It was the starting point for their whole water system. That initial massive surge of water, their engineering would have to tame it. That was their first principle of water wisdom: work with the land's logic. Don't fight the flood, guide it. That violent rush into the sick was raw potential, but potential is dangerous if it's not controlled. So when that torrent reached their city's door, what did they do? How do you calm a flash flood? Their answer was simple, and it started right inside the mouth of the canyon. They built a wall, but not to keep people out. It was to guide water in, right at the narrow entrance to the sick where the floodwaters would first try to surge through. They built a massive diversion dam. It wasn't meant to hold the water back completely. That would have been impossible. The force of a desert flash flood would shatter any wall. So instead, they built a deflector. Like a traffic director at the mouth of a chaotic, liquid highway, this dam, built from precisely cut sandstone, stood at an angle. When the flood hit it, the wall didn't try to stop the water. It redirected it gently, firmly. The torrent was shunted away from the sick entrance into a specially carved channel, a bypass tunnel that ran alongside the canyon. That was the masterstroke. They acknowledged the flood's power and gave it a new path, a safer path, a controlled exit, and they repeated that principle throughout the Petra basin. At the head of other wadis, smaller diversion walls did the same thing on a local scale. They caught that initial sediment-heavy rush, let the grit and stones settle out. So the cleaner water could flow onward. That was immediate capture, large scale. It was the difference between a disaster and a delivery. One moment, the canyon is a raging river. The next, that destructive energy is harnessed, split, sent where it's needed. The threat is neutralized, transformed into a resource. But capturing the flood was just the start. You've stopped the city from drowning. Now you have the harder question. Where does all that water go? You can't just let it run out into the desert and vanish. The real engineering challenge began once the flood was tamed. How do you store a river that only exists for a few hours? The flood was diverted, and the water entered a new phase. It wasn't a wild force anymore. It became a managed commodity, flowing through the city's veins. The Nabataeans built a hidden circulatory system, a network of channels, turning the whole landscape into hydraulic machinery. These weren't ditches, they were precision conduits, carved into the living rock of the cliffs, or built from stone, lined with a special waterproof cement. Some channels were open, others were covered, to stop evaporation, to stop contamination. They snaked along canyon walls, crossed over pathways on elevated aqueducts, disappeared into the heart of Petra. This network was their second principle. Channel the flow, control every drop. The genius was in the gradient. These channels weren't dug haphazardly. They were laid out with a subtle, consistent slope, calculated so the water would move steadily, using nothing but gravity. A slow, gentle descent, too steep, and the water rushes too fast, it erodes the channels. Arrives in a useless surge, too shallow, and it stagnates, collects sediment, breeds illness. The Nabataeans found the perfect balance. They understood the physics of their terrain, surveying lines across rock faces to ensure a constant, reliable trickle from the high collection dams all the way down to the city's reservoirs and cisterns. This gravity-fed system required no pumps, no external energy. It was self-sustaining, powered by the simple fact that water seeks its lowest level, but reliability meant planning for the unexpected. A single channel could crack, could be blocked by a rockfall, so they engineered redundancy for the most critical areas, the city center, the royal district. They built multiple channels. If one line was compromised, another could take over. This wasn't just backup, it was system resilience. They weren't building for a best-case scenario. They were planning for centuries of operation, anticipating wear, anticipating damage, anticipating the need for maintenance without interrupting the city's lifeblood. This network transformed Petra from a collection of buildings into a true organism. Water could be directed to public fountains, to the gardens of the wealthy, to the workshops of artisans, to the massive cisterns that formed the next layer of their strategy. The channels delivered the water, but where did it all go? To wait out the long, dry months, the answer lies in the city's secret hollow heart. Channels were just the arteries. A living body needs a heart, somewhere to keep its lifeblood. The rhythm of the desert for the Nabataeans was this long, dry silence, then these brief, violent downpours. Their whole civilization was about bridging that gap, stretching a few hours of torrent across months of thirst. So their third principle was storage, and they did it with this quiet, distributed genius. They turned the rock under Petra itself into a hidden reservoir. You look at the cliffs, you see them, rounded openings just a few feet across, carved high up. Or larger, square doorways at ground level. Those are cistern mouths, countless private ones for homes, for estates, and big public ones like the reservoir at the base of the high place of sacrifice. They weren't just holes, they were engineered chambers, carved deep into the solid sandstone or built from blocks. Their shapes maximized volume, minimized surface area to slow evaporation. But the real secret was the lining. They used a local material, hamra, a special clay mix. They plastered the inside of every cistern with it, an impervious seal. That waterproofing was everything. In porous sandstone, an unlined cistern would lose its water to the earth in days. The hamra lining meant the water they captured would stay. Waiting, it created a distributed storage network. Think of it not as one central bank, but hundreds of small, local savings accounts across the city. A large public reservoir near a temple served the community. Dozens of smaller, private cisterns caught runoff from rooftops for families. This strategy was resilient. If one cistern was contaminated or damaged, it didn't cripple the system. The loss was local. The network stayed functional. It also placed water security at multiple levels: the state, the neighborhood, the household. Everyone was part of the act of preservation. The result was a city that carried its own rainy season inside it. Long after the last storm cloud was gone, long after the wadis were silent and dusty, water was still there. Drawn from these cool, dark chambers, that subterranean bank changed the psychology of life in Petra. It turned scarcity into security. The anxiety of the next storm, the fear of the coming drought, was softened by knowing what was in storage. It allowed for permanence, for gardens, for industry, for the dense urban life that made Petra a marvel. But storing water is only half of it. How do you make sure what you've saved stays pure, safe to drink over all those months? The Nabataeans had an answer for that too, a final, elegant step. Storing water is one thing, keeping it clean is something else. A reservoir full of silt or contaminated water, that's worse than useless. It becomes a source of illness, and the Nabataeans understood this. Their fourth principle was purification, a quiet process of filtering and settling. Because the water coming down from the high plateaus wasn't clear, it carried the desert with it, fine sand, grit, organic debris, all of it churned up by the flood. If that slurry got into their channels and cisterns, it would clog everything. It would slowly fill their storage with mud, so they built pauses into the system. Deliberate moments of stillness. Archaeologists find these features throughout Petra. Wide, shallow basins carved right into the bedrock or built from stone. They were placed at strategic points, often just after a diversion dam or before a channel entered a critical cistern. The principle was simple. As the floodwater entered these basins, the space expanded. The water's speed dropped, and with that loss of velocity, gravity could work. The heavier particles, the sand and silt, they just sank to the bottom. What flowed out the other side was clearer water. These weren't passive features, they were maintained. The settled sediment was cleaned out periodically. A routine act of care. In some areas, they might have used layers of sand and gravel inside these tanks, creating a more advanced porous filter to trap even finer particles. This attention to clarity speaks volumes. It shows a society thinking not just about quantity, but about quality, about public well-being, providing cleaner water for drinking and cooking that directly impacted the community's health. Its resilience, it also protected their investment. Keeping silt out of the channels meant less maintenance. It meant the delicate gradient of their aqueducts wouldn't be altered by built-up sediment. It ensured their cisterns kept their full capacity for generations. This was preventative engineering, a long-term vision that considered the system's entire life cycle. So the water that finally reached a Petra household had been on a long journey, captured from a flash flood, tamed by a dam, channeled along a precise grade, settled in a quieting basin, stored in a cool, dark vault. It was a transformation, from a destructive force of nature into a reliable, refined resource. But this entire system, this hidden empire of pipes and pools, it depended on one final element. It required constant, vigilant care. A system this complex doesn't run itself for centuries. It needs guardians. The question is, who were the people that kept the water flowing? The water was clean and it was stored, but a reservoir only matters if you can get to it. That last problem was distribution. Getting that water from the city's hidden heart out to every home, every workshop, every public space. The Nabataeans had a fifth principle for this: precision. The system didn't stop at the big cisterns. It went further, like capillaries, right into the city itself. You can see it in the ruins, small terracotta pipes fitted together carefully, stone channels under floors, bronze taps and spouts, intricate. These weren't just holes in a wall. They were engineered in points. In the bigger buildings, the great temple, the royal palace, the piping gets so sophisticated it points to something: pressurized delivery. By controlling the gradient of their channels, using gravity from a high cistern, they could create pressure enough to send water upward to a second-story bath, to a fountain in a courtyard. That's high-level hydraulic engineering. It meant water wasn't just something you got from a communal well. It could be a private thing, delivered when you wanted it. The most public show of this were the nymphea. These weren't just decorative fountains, they were functional monuments. A nymphaeum was this grand structure, often several stories, faced with marble and sculpture, water cascading from spouts into a basin below. It did a few things. It was a public water source where anyone could come fill a jar, drink, talk. It was a cooling spot too, the sound and mist giving relief from the desert heat. But third, and maybe most important, it was a statement, a display of total control over the environment. Look, it said, we have so much water, we can let it dance in the sun just for beauty. It showed wealth, sure, but deeper than that, it showed security. The confidence from a system so robust, so reliable, that you could perform abundance. This last-mile delivery changed Petra. It went from a city that had water to a city defined by water. It raised the standard of living to match any Mediterranean city. A desert dweller could have a private bath. A garden could be watered not by bucket but by a directed flow. That precision distribution turned engineering into daily comfort. It closed the cycle, but a system this advanced, this vital, it didn't run itself. It needed a specialized class, not just builders but keepers, who were the guardians of this water empire. What knowledge did they hold that kept Petra alive so long? The most important thing about the sick is something you usually can't see. Up on the north wall, there's a channel cut right into the sandstone. It starts near the entrance and goes along the whole winding canyon, almost a mile. You can see the groove if you know to look, a clean cut in the rock, sometimes covered with old stone slabs. That wasn't a backup, that was the main line, the primary artery bringing life into Petra. It came from the Moses Spring, a permanent oasis outside. The Nabataeans didn't just use that spring. They took all of its water and sent it through this channel, only this channel, straight into the city. The flash flood system handled storm water, but this gave them something else. A constant flow, clear, predictable, a baseline, like the city's steady heartbeat under the pounding pulse of the rainy season. Building it was an act of faith in geometry. The spring is higher than the city, but the path isn't straight. It's a twisting canyon with an uneven floor. To keep a gentle flow, the gradient had to be perfect. Too steep, and the water would rush down and erode the channel. Too shallow, and it would stall, collect silt, never arrive. So engineers surveyed the whole winding route. They calculated a drop of maybe a few inches every 100 feet. Then they carved that exact slope, inch by inch, into a solid rock wall over that whole distance. The work is hard to imagine. Workers hanging on ropes cutting this shallow trough with hand tools, making sure it never wavered around a bend. It was long-term thinking. Not for one ruler's reign, infrastructure for the ages, and they integrated it with subtlety. The channel runs beside the sixth main path, the sacred way to the treasury. But it's often just out of sight or runs under the stones people walked on. That was deliberate. They wove the utilitarian into the spiritual. The water's journey mirrored the pilgrim's journey. Both moved from the outside world into the heart of the city, guided by the canyon. The sound of that flowing water would have been a constant soundtrack in the sick. A reminder the city ahead was alive, sustained. It turned a geological marvel into a hydraulic machine. The sick wasn't just a canyon anymore, it was a covered aqueduct. A temple corridor with a bloodstream. This solved the last big problem of urban life. It gave direct, clean water to the important spaces, the royal district, the main temples, the markets. It meant even in deep drought, when cisterns were rationed, a thread of fresh water never stopped. It allowed continuous ritual use at the temples. It supplied public fountains. It was the ultimate control. They hadn't just tamed the violent floods. They'd also harnessed a gentle spring, bending its will through stone, making nature's consistency their own. That hidden groove is maybe the purest expression of Nabataean genius. It asks no attention, it just works, and for centuries it meant the difference between a fortified outpost and a thriving capital. But a perfect system needs perfect care. Who knew how to keep that slope clear? Who listened for the change in the water's song that meant a blockage? The channel's existence points to a deeper layer, the keepers of the flow. The Nabataeans could handle the floods, but a city needs more than storms. It needs something constant. And they found that, a few kilometers from Petra's canyon, there's a place where water comes out of the ground. Ain Musa, the spring of Moses. This wasn't a seasonal thing. It was always there, a steady flow from the limestone all year. In a place defined by dryness, a spring like that isn't just water, it's a kind of miracle. It becomes sacred, stories attached to it about Moses striking the rock for his people. That story wasn't just a tale, it was a way to understand something unexplainable. It made the source holy. For them, the practical and the divine were always mixed. To control Ain Musa was to hold something eternal, and they did control it. They didn't just use the spring, they claimed it. They built an aqueduct, a stone channel that ran for kilometers over rough land, all the way to the entrance of the sick. This was long-distance engineering. They had to survey a path with a gentle slope the whole way, over hills, around rock, across washes. They built support walls in places. In others, they cut the channel right into the bedrock. This wasn't a ditch. It was a protected conduit to bring the water without losing it, without it getting dirty, straight into their water network. It was the centerpiece. The floods gave them volume, the cisterns gave them storage, but Ain Musa gave them certainty, a pure baseline that never stopped. Controlling it meant power, spiritual and political. The priesthood probably managed the rites at the spring, connecting the king's authority to the god's gift. To guarantee this water was to guarantee life itself. It made political leadership a form of stewardship. The king wasn't just ruling, he was the one who made sure the eternal spring reached his people. This mix of need and sacred meaning is how you understand Petra's endurance. The water system wasn't just engineering, it was a living ritual, maintaining the aqueduct, cleaning the channels. These were acts of duty, civic and religious. The steady flow from Ain Musa was a daily reminder of a covenant between the people, their leaders, and the land they'd learned to listen to. It was the quiet pulse under all the grandeur. But even with a sacred spring feeding a perfect network, the real strength was human. The engineers designed it, but who kept it working day to day? Who listened for the slight change in the water's sound that meant a crack or a clog? That silent, ongoing work of keeping everything flowing, that might have been the deepest achievement. Walking down the main street in Petra, you'd notice the coolness first, a kind of dampness coming up from the stone. This was the colonnaded street, busy, lined with shops. But under the pavement, channels ran. Water was everywhere in that city, not just a utility built into the design. There were public fountains at corners, places to drink and meet. Workshops for pottery or dyeing cloth had water right there, turning it into work. And the desert dust, it was held back by that dampness in the air. The air felt cleaner, easier to breathe. That was urban hydrology, engineering the atmosphere itself. The Nabataeans weren't just bringing water in, they were using it to make a better place to live. The Great Temple shows this at its largest scale. There, water was part of the spectacle. Archaeologists found a huge pool in the temple's lower courtyard. Not a small pond, a big stone-lined pool. On a hot day, it would have acted as a heat sink, cooling the air around it. Evaporation would have created a microclimate. A pocket of relief, and the sound of water feeding it that would have been a quiet background during rituals. So it had a dual role. Practically, it tempered the desert heat. Symbolically, it meant abundance, divine favor. A temple with a pool in the desert, that's a statement of control. It blurred sacred and civic, showing the god's blessings in the comfort of the people. This went into private life too. Wealthy homes had courtyards with little gardens fed by terracotta pipes. A trickling fountain in a shaded patio turned a house into an oasis. The psychological effect in a dry landscape, the constant presence of moving water, its sound and coolness that was a daily luxury. It meant normalcy. Safety, sophistication, the engineering served culture directly. It allowed public bathing for community, not just cleanliness. It let them grow decorative plants, adding green to the rose-red city. Their water mastery showed survival was just the start. Real civilization was building a life of grace, comfort, even in an unlikely place. And it makes you wonder, if they built all this to last, what happened when the keepers of the water finally walked away? A city can't live on just water. Petra had thousands of people living there permanently. Merchants, artisans, priests, families, they all needed food. And you can't feed a whole city by bringing everything in on caravans. It's too risky, too expensive. To be truly independent, they had to grow their own. So the Nabataeans did what they'd already done. They took their water empire and extended it outward. They turned their mastery of the canyon into a mastery of the land around it. The same principles that filled Petra's cisterns were now aimed at something else: agriculture. They looked at the dry, rocky slopes of the wider basin, and they didn't see barren land. They saw potential. The challenge here was different. It wasn't about channeling a violent flood into a tank. It was about persuasion. How do you convince a hillside to grow crops? Their answer is still written into the landscape, lines of stone that trace the contours of the valleys. Archaeologists find them all around Petra, long, low walls built in steps along the slopes. These are agricultural terraces. They look simple, just piles of rock, but each one was a calculated move. A terrace does two things. First, it creates a flat surface on a steep hill. A place where soil can gather and stay, instead of washing away in the next rain. Second, and more important, it slows water down. When rain fell on a terraced hillside, it couldn't just rush to the valley floor. It would hit the first wall, pool for a moment, soak into the soil behind it, then overflow gently to the terrace below. It was a way of forcing the landscape to absorb every drop. To drink slowly, these terraces turned sporadic rainfall into a sustained resource for roots. They were the first step in making farmland from the desert's skeleton. But terraces alone aren't enough in a place where months can pass between rains. So the Nabataeans brought the water to them. They built a second network, branching off from the main urban channels. Smaller, carefully graded aqueducts ran along the rims of valleys. They delivered a measured flow from the city's reservoirs out to these terraced fields. This was allocated water, a deliberate sharing of the precious resource between city life and food production. They grew what the Mediterranean world wanted. Grapes for wine, olives for oil, grains like barley and wheat, fig trees, pomegranates. These weren't just subsistence crops, they were cash crops adding to the city's economic strength. Evidence suggests they even had garden plots closer to the city, smaller irrigated spaces for vegetables and herbs, making the urban environment itself more productive. More green, this agricultural hydrology completed a loop. A closed loop. Water captured from a flash flood on the high plateau would flow through a diversion dam, settle in a basin, run through a channel, fill a cistern in Petra, and then, when needed, be released again along a feeder channel. To irrigate a terraced vineyard on a sun-baked slope, from rainfall to harvest, the same water served the public fountain, the temple pool, and the root of an olive tree. It was a cycle of sustenance engineered into existence. This changed the Petra Basin from a trading fortress into a true oasis, a self-sufficient engine where water moved in a continuous circuit of support from the geological to the human. It created a buffer against the uncertainty of trade. A bad year for caravans didn't have to mean a hungry year for the city. Their security was now rooted in the very land they had learned to listen to. But this level of control, this complete weaving together of nature and human need, it points to a society with remarkable organization, who decided how much water went to the palace and how much to the fields. Who managed the allocation between a public bath and a farmer's vineyard? The answer isn't in the stone channels, it's in the silent rules that governed them. Stone channels and terraces, they don't maintain themselves. A system this intricate, this vital, it required something beyond brilliant design. It required a social code. An unwritten law of water. Every drop that flowed into Petra, from the sacred spring to the last flood, it represented a choice: who gets it first, how much they get. Who fixes a broken pipe? Who settles a dispute between neighbors over a diverted trickle? The physical engineering was a marvel, but the social engineering that sustained it for centuries, that was perhaps the greater achievement. It points to a society with a highly developed sense of collective responsibility, meticulous organization. At the top, there was almost certainly a central authority. A water magistrate or a council of elders with engineers. Their role was strategic oversight. They managed the grand allocations, deciding when to open the sluice gates from the main reservoirs to irrigate the terraced fields before planting season. Authorizing repairs to the sick aqueduct. Their decisions balanced immediate human need with long-term security. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was an act of foresight, ensuring the city's heartbeat continued for generations. This authority likely held a sacred dimension, too, since water came from the gods, from Ain Musa, the spring of Moses. Managing it was a priestly duty. The king or his appointed steward didn't just control a resource, he mediated a divine gift. This fused political power with spiritual obligation, making good water management a cornerstone of legitimate rule. Beneath this central authority worked the keepers of the flow, a guild of hydraulic engineers and skilled maintenance crews. These were the experts who understood the subtle gradients, who could diagnose a blocked channel by listening to the water's song change. They knew the recipes for the waterproof hammer plaster. They possessed the surveying knowledge to realign a damaged section of aqueduct. This technical knowledge was precious. It was likely passed down within families or tight-knit apprenticeships. Losing that knowledge would mean the slow death of the city, so they protected it, cultivated it. They were the physicians for Petra's circulatory system, on constant, quiet patrol. Then came the distribution, and here water mirrored society. The grand nymphaeum on the colonnaded street provided for all. A public fountain was a social equalizer, a place for news and community, but the network also fed directly into elite residences and temple complexes. The wealthy homes with their private courtyard gardens and bathing pools had a direct, reliable connection. This wasn't merely a luxury, it was a visible marker of status. Your access to water and your control over its immediate availability demonstrated your place in the social order. For most, water was a shared public resource collected daily. For the few, it was a private convenience piped into the home. This hierarchy was engineered right into the plumbing. Yet, for this system to endure without constant conflict, there must have been clear, accepted rules for the shared spaces. Local wardens probably managed neighborhood cisterns, ensuring fair drawing times. Customs would have governed how runoff from a rooftop could be used. Disputes over a diverted channel or accusations of hoarding would need swift, fair resolution, perhaps by local elders or the water magistrate's deputies. This created a layered governance, grand strategy at the top, technical expertise in the middle, and communal cooperation at the grassroots. It was a culture of shared fate. Everyone understood that the system's failure meant collective hardship. This ingrained ethos of stewardship, of maintaining your section of channel, of not taking more than your allotted share, was the intangible mortar that held the stone channels together. The sustainable operation over centuries tells us this. It wasn't a tyranny of water control, nor was it a free-for-all. It was a negotiated order, a social contract written in water law. The Nabataeans engineered more than a hydraulic system. They engineered a society capable of sustaining it. They built institutions of knowledge and fairness around a flowing resource. This social code was their final and most fragile masterpiece, because when that code finally eroded, when the shared understanding broke down, the stone channels, for all their perfection, were just empty grooves in a dying rock. The channels and pipes, they were only as strong as the materials. A brilliant design in weak stuff would have crumbled in a season. The Nabataeans understood that. Their engineering went down to the molecules. They mastered material science. They worked with what the desert gave them and transformed it through innovation. Their toolkit was simple: sandstone, clay, lime, broken pottery. From these, they built a water empire meant to last. The bedrock of Petra itself was their main building block. That rose red sandstone, but it's porous. Water soaks right through. You can't just carve a channel into living sandstone and expect it to hold water. It would vanish, so they didn't just carve, they lined. Inside every critical channel, every cistern, they applied a special plaster, opus signinum. The Nabataeans probably had their own name for it. A mix of slaked lime mortar and crushed pottery, ground to powder. This wasn't a guess, it was a calculated recipe. The lime was the binder, the crushed pottery coxiopsto, that was the magic. The sharp, angular fragments locked together in the lime matrix. It created a dense, almost concrete-like finish. When it cured, it was hard as rock and utterly impermeable. Water could not pass through. This lining turned a porous trench into a sealed conduit. It was their first line of defense against loss. They applied it with care, creating smooth, curved interiors to minimize friction. That waterproof cement is why we can still see the channels today. Long after the water stopped, the lining held, protecting the soft sandstone underneath from erosion. The stone itself was handled with precision. The diversion dams, the aqueduct walls, the cistern openings, these were built from locally quarried blocks. But they weren't just piled up. The Nabataeans were expert stone cutters. They shaped each block with flat, smooth faces and squared edges. They fitted them together, often without any mortar. The weight of the stone and the precision of the fit created the strength. This technique, dry stone construction, it allowed for slight movement. During an earthquake or ground settling, the blocks could shift minutely without the whole structure collapsing. It was flexible, durable. They understood their environment. They built for its realities. For the smaller distribution lines, they used fired clay, terracotta pipes. These weren't crude, hand-formed tubes. They were manufactured to standard sizes, cylinders about a foot long, with a flanged end to fit snugly into the next pipe. The joints were sealed with more of that waterproof mortar. This standardization is telling. It means production was organized. A maintenance crew could carry replacement pipes of a known size and know they would fit. It speaks to a systematized, repeatable approach. The pipes were thick-walled and sturdy, able to be buried under streets without cracking. Every material choice was a response to a local condition. The sandstone was everywhere, so they learned to cut and seal it. The clay for pipes was available in the valleys. The lime for mortar came from burning limestone in the hills. Even the crushed pottery in their plaster was a form of recycling. They used what they had, but they used it with intelligence. They didn't import marble or exotic hardwoods. They took the desert's own bones and sinews and, through knowledge, made them resilient. This appropriateness is why their work endures. Modern concrete might be stronger, but it cracks and decays in its own ways. The Nabataean system, built from compatible materials that expanded and contracted with the desert's temperature swings, that breathed with the stone it was attached to, it achieved a kind of harmony. It wasn't fighting the landscape, it was a refined extension of it. The proof is in the silence. For centuries, their system lay dormant, abandoned, subjected to scorching heat, freezing nights, violent floods. And yet the channels are still there, the cistern mouths still open, the waterproof plaster in many places is still intact. That is the ultimate testament. Their material science created a legacy in stone and clay that time has struggled to erase. But materials and social codes are one thing. A civilization also expresses itself in what it chooses to show. To celebrate, what did the Nabataeans build when they weren't just solving problems but making art? A perfect system is never finished. It breathes, it needs attention. The Nabataean water network, with all its stone and mortar, was a living utility. It survived for centuries. That wasn't just about the initial construction being flawless. It was about a culture of relentless, quiet care. You can picture the rhythm of that maintenance. After a flash flood, teams of workers would move through the canyons. The work wasn't glamorous, it was essential, clearing the silt and debris from the wide, quieting basins, checking the diversion dams for new cracks from the force of the torrent. They'd inspect the long channel in the sick, brushing away wind-blown sand, making sure no rockfall had blocked the gentle flow. This was preventative medicine for the city's circulatory system. And this work demanded a deep, localized knowledge. You couldn't learn it from a scroll. It was passed down generation to generation, from master to apprentice. A keeper of the channels would know the sound of water flowing freely, versus the gurgle of a partial blockage. He'd know which stretches of plaster were most vulnerable to the winter freeze, needing a fresh coat of that special hammer mix before the rains came. He'd understand the seasonal patterns, when to expect the first test of the flood defenses, when to start drawing down certain cisterns in anticipation of refilling. That knowledge was the true software running on the hardware of stone. It was fragile, it was human, and it was absolutely critical, and the system itself wasn't static. Archaeologists see the evidence of adaptation written into the rock. Channels were widened in certain areas. New branch lines were carved to feed expanding neighborhoods as Petra's population grew. At the city's height, the demand for water would have been immense, not just for drinking but for increased industry, more elaborate bathhouses, grander gardens. The engineers responded. They tapped new springs further out, building longer aqueducts. They carved additional cisterns into newly claimed cliffs. That expansion shows a society that was listening and responding. The water system wasn't a completed project from their founding. It was an ongoing dialogue, a dialogue with their own success and with the environment. This adaptability might have even responded to climatic shifts. The evidence is subtle, but periods of increased aridity, altered rainfall patterns would have been a direct threat. The Nabataean response would have been a tightening of the system's efficiency, more meticulous maintenance to prevent any loss, maybe a recalibration of water allocation, shifting more to essential drinking supplies and staple crops. The fact that Petra thrived through so many generations suggests an institutional capacity to adjust. They weren't rigid. Their engineering principles provided a framework, but within that framework there was room. Room for innovation, for expansion, for smart contraction. That dynamic relationship is what separates a monument from a civilization. A monument is built and left. A civilization nurtures, it watches, it learns, it mends. The Nabataeans didn't just conquer the desert's water problem once. They recommitted to that conquest every season. With every cleared channel, every repaired seal, their legacy isn't just in what they built. It's in the centuries of quiet work they invested to keep it alive. That work was a form of faith, a belief in the future of their city. But what happens when that faith begins to fade, when the keepers of the knowledge are gone, and the dialogue with the desert falls silent? The ultimate test of any system is how it fails. For Petra, the end wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow unraveling, a series of cracks in the foundation no one could mend. The decline is written in dry channels and silent cisterns, a testament to fragility when the world shifts. A pivotal moment likely came in the year 363. A massive earthquake. The tremors would have been catastrophic for a city carved from cliffs, but the most devastating damage was invisible at first. It happened underground in the network of channels. The precise gradients surveyed over miles would have been fractured. Aqueducts along canyon walls sheared off. Cisterns in the bedrock developed hairline leaks. The diversion dams, crucial for taming floods, knocked out of alignment. This wasn't just broken buildings. It was a direct attack on the city's circulatory system. The earthquake crippled its life support. Repairing that damage would have required everything the Nabataeans had at their height. The full technical knowledge of the hydraulic guilds, a robust, centralized authority to organize labor and resources, a society united by that shared sense of fate. But by the 4th century, the world had changed. Petra was part of the Roman Empire, then the Byzantine. The trade routes, its lifeblood, had shifted toward the sea. Political and economic attention moved elsewhere. The specialized knowledge of the waterkeepers may have already begun to fade, not passed on. When the earthquake hit, the social and technical capacity for a full restoration may have simply been gone. They could patch a channel here, clear a cistern there, but the system as an integrated whole was broken. Compounding this was the environment itself. Evidence from tree rings and sediment cores shows the region entered a prolonged period of increased aridity around this time. The rains, already sporadic, became even less reliable. The flash floods, the source of their water empire, grew weaker, less frequent. This placed an unbearable strain on a damaged system. A network designed for abundance now had to operate on scarcity with broken parts. The sacred spring, Ain Musa, still flowed, but with the distribution channels fractured, could its water even reach the city center? The cisterns could still be filled, but with less rain and cracked linings, how long would that reserve last? The result was a slow, grinding retreat. Neighborhoods higher up the slopes farthest from reliable water were abandoned first. The intricate terraced farms on the valley rims, dependent on delivered irrigation, fell into disuse. Without constant maintenance, the stone walls crumbled, the soil washed away, the population concentrated in the city core, closer to the few functioning fountains and cisterns. The grand nymphaeum fell silent, the gardens in the courtyards of the wealthy withered. The sound of flowing water, once the city's constant soundtrack, was replaced by wind through empty streets. Petra did not vanish overnight. It faded over generations into a shadow, a magnificent stone shell slowly emptying of life. The people likely moved in families and in groups to places where water was easier to find. Where the old, broken system didn't need constant, heroic effort just for a basic drink. They left behind a monument not just to their ingenuity, but to its limits. This ending transforms Petra. It shows that sustainability is not a one-time achievement. It is a continuous act of will, of knowledge, of social cohesion. The Nabataeans built a system in harmony with their environment, but that harmony required vigilant upkeep. When the unexpected shock came, the earthquake, and was followed by a slow, environmental stress, the arid shift, the society that could have responded was already diminished. The physical engineering was still there in the rock, but the human engine that powered it, the shared code of care, had stalled. Their story asks a difficult question. What are we maintaining right now, whose failure we cannot afford? What knowledge are we passing on that our descendants will need to keep their world flowing? The silence in the sick is an echo, a reminder that all empires, even empires of water, are conversations with nature, and when the conversation stops, the desert always reclaims its voice. For 1,000 years, the water system was silent. Sand filled the channels, dust filled the cisterns. Petra became a legend, something the Bedouin tribes would talk about. Then in 1812, the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt went in, disguised. He saw those huge facades cut into the rose-red stone, the treasury. The monastery. He saw a dead city of tombs. What he didn't see was the machinery, the network that made it live, that was invisible to him, a ghost in the rock. It would take another century for that to be rediscovered, and it wouldn't start by looking at the monuments. It started by looking down at the ground, at the subtle marks on the land. That's what modern archaeology does. It's this slow process of reverse engineering, putting together a lost language of water management from stone fragments and erosion patterns. The first clues weren't in big digs, they were in surveys. Archaeologists walking the basin started noticing things. A line of stones on a hillside, too straight to be natural. Rounded openings high on a cliff, a long groove carved along the entire wall of the sick. These were footprints. Mapping them showed a pattern, a web over the whole area. Every cliff, every valley was part of one hydraulic design. The city wasn't just built in the landscape was the main engineering piece. That changed Petra from an architectural wonder to a geo-hydrological masterpiece, but surveys only showed the surface. The real secrets were buried. That's where technology came in, ground-penetrating radar. Teams could pass it over a flat area near the colonnaded street, and the screen would show the outline of a buried pipeline. A perfect circle 2 feet down. In other spots, radar hinted at huge hollow spaces, monumental cisterns hidden under silt. This gave them a map of the underworld. A blueprint of the hidden veins. Then came the excavation, brushing sand away grain by grain from a stone channel. The details there told the story. The smooth interior, still coated with that pink waterproof plaster. The precise join where one terracotta pipe fitted into the next. A sluice gate, a stone slab in a groove to divert water from one channel to another. That was the control panel. Each find was a puzzle piece, a ceramic tap handle, a sedimentation basin layered with ancient silt. These weren't just artifacts. They were instructions showing the steps of capture, settlement, delivery. Maybe the deepest insights come from reading the land itself. Hydrologists study the canyon walls, the wadi beds. They can calculate the volume of water a diversion dam was meant to handle. They can see, in the cut of a channel, the exact gradient the engineers wanted. By analyzing sediment cores from dry cisterns, they can reconstruct historical rainfall. They can tell when the floods were strong and when they began to fade. The landscape becomes a historical document. The stone tells the story of the water that shaped it and the hands that guided that water. Each season adds another piece. A newly mapped aqueduct bringing water from a spring 5 kilometers away. Farm terraces on a remote hillside, fed by a channel no one saw before. A massive underground reservoir near the Great Temple, its capacity recalculated. With every addition, the picture gets more sophisticated, more awe-inspiring. This isn't a collection of clever tricks. It's a unified, city-scale plan. Conceived with foresight and built with generational patience, the archaeology lets us see what Burckhardt couldn't. It lets us trace the flow of life through the stone. It shows the true monument of Petra isn't the facade you photograph. It's the empty channel beside it, the one that once sang with the sound of a conquered desert. Rome's aqueducts are legendary. Those stone arches across the countryside, they're monuments to imperial power. They moved water from distant mountains to supply cities of 1 million people. It was a statement of conquest over distance, but the Nabataean approach at Petra was something entirely different. Their challenge wasn't distance, it was scarcity. Their genius wasn't in spanning valleys. It was in squeezing every possible drop from a landscape that offered almost nothing. So to understand what they built, you have to look beyond the Roman model. The contrast starts with the environment. Rome was built on the Tiber with reliable springs and rivers. Their problem was volume sanitation for a teeming metropolis. Petra was founded in a desert canyon. Annual rainfall could be less than 6 inches. It arrived in unpredictable, violent bursts. The Romans could afford to be extravagant, moving water over dozens of miles. The Nabataeans could not afford to lose a single cupful. That difference shaped everything. Roman engineering solved problems with overwhelming scale and labor. Nabataean engineering solved them with meticulous, localized precision. Technologically, the Romans mastered the arch and concrete. They built elevated channels across great spans. Petra's system is almost invisible by comparison. Instead of arches, they carved channels directly into cliff faces. Instead of vast reservoirs above ground, they hollowed out the bedrock beneath their feet into countless cisterns. The Roman system was a spectacular public display. The Nabataean system was a hidden, integrated network, woven into the very fabric of the city and the hills. One was a loud proclamation of power, the other was a quiet, intimate dialogue with the land. Their purpose diverges too. Roman aqueducts supplied public baths, fountains, the homes of the elite. They enhanced an existing abundance. At Petra, the water system wasn't about enhancement. It was about existential survival. It created the possibility of a permanent, large settlement where one should not have existed. It enabled agriculture through terracing and irrigation, turning the barren basin into a food-producing oasis. the Roman system supported a civilization. The Nabataean system was the civilization. Without it, Petra is just a defensible canyon. With it, it became a capital. This comparison doesn't diminish Rome. It reframes Petra. The Nabataeans weren't trying to replicate imperial grandeur. They were solving a harder, more constrained puzzle. Where Rome used brute force over geography, Petra used finesse. Where Rome imported water, Petra convinced the local environment to give up every secret it held. Their achievement is measured not in miles of aqueduct, but in centuries of sustained life in a place that defied it. It's the difference between conquering a resource and collaborating with a scarcity. That focus on hyper-efficiency, on closed-loop systems where every drop is captured, stored, filtered, and reused, it feels remarkably modern. In a world facing water stress, Petra's model of sustainable precision, rather than Roman-scale abundance, might hold the more relevant lessons. It shows that resilience isn't always about having more. Sometimes it's about mastering the art of having just enough and making it last. Petra's silent channels speak to us now. The principles that kept that city alive for centuries, they aren't just history. They're a blueprint because water is becoming more precious. With climate uncertainty, droughts get deeper, storms more erratic. What the Nabataeans did shifts from a curiosity to an instruction. Their first lesson is perception. They saw water not as a single event but as a system. From the sky down to the soil, today we often treat rainwater as a problem. Something to drain away, channel into sewers, rush out to sea. Petra teaches us to see it as the primary resource it is. Modern rainwater harvesting, from a simple barrel to a large rooftop catchment, that's a direct echo of their diversion dams and cisterns. It's about capturing the bounty when it comes, because you don't know when it will come again. Their second lesson is appropriateness. They used what the land provided. Sandstone, clay, lime. Their whole system was built from hyper-local materials. No long supply chains, no imported technology. That minimized their footprint and maximized resilience. For us, that means designing solutions that fit the local ecology, not imposing one-size-fits-all concrete megaprojects. It means permeable pavements that let groundwater recharge, restoring wetlands that act as natural sponges, choosing building materials that suit the climate. Sustainability begins with listening to the place you're in. Just as they did, the third lesson is designing for extremes. The Nabataeans didn't engineer for average rainfall. They engineered for the catastrophic flash flood and the prolonged drought. Their system had to handle both. Our modern infrastructure, built for a stable climate that's gone, often fails this test. We see it when storm drains overflow and when reservoirs run dry. Petra's model urges redundancy and flexibility. Systems that can store vast quantities in wet periods and meter them out in dry ones. Cities that can safely absorb a deluge, not just funnel it away. Perhaps their most powerful lesson is distributed resilience. Petra's water security didn't depend on one massive reservoir. It was a network, hundreds of cisterns and channels. If one failed, others functioned. This decentralized model is crucial for our vulnerable, centralized systems. Imagine a modern neighborhood where every home harvests its own rainwater. Where communities have local greywater recycling. Where urban gardens are fed by captured stormwater. That creates a web of security, less prone to catastrophic failure. It mirrors Petra's blend of public reservoirs and private cisterns, a shared responsibility for a common good. Finally, Petra teaches holistic integration. They didn't separate water management from urban planning or agriculture or social governance. The water channels dictated the street layout. The terraced farms were extensions of the hydraulic network. Social codes ensured fair allocation. We often manage these domains in isolated silos: water departments, city planners, agricultural boards. Petra's legacy insists that true sustainability requires weaving them back together. designing cities where water shapes green spaces, nourishes local food, fosters community stewardship. This ancient desert city, then, is more than a tourist destination. It's a 2,000-year-old case study in adaptive engineering, a testament to working with environmental logic, not against it. For modern engineers, policymakers, community planners, Petra offers a quiet wisdom. It shows that scarcity need not be a limit. It can be the mother of ingenuity. Their greatest monument isn't the treasury carved in rock. It's the enduring idea that survival, even flourishing, is possible in the most unlikely places. If we have the wisdom to listen and the patience to build in harmony, stone and silence only get you so far. To really understand a system meant for movement, you have to see it move. That's where modern technology comes in. It turns archaeology from studying static things into a kind of dynamic simulation. Researchers build a digital Petra. They take precise measurements from every map channel, every cistern, every dam, and they create a three-dimensional computer model of the whole basin. It's a virtual twin of the ancient city, but with one thing put back: water. You can simulate a storm over the high plateau. Watch digital floodwaters gather speed, sheet across the rock, converge at the mouth of the Sick. The model calculates the force, the volume. It shows the moment that torrent hits the Great Diversion Dam, and how the angle of that stone wall shunts the whole deluge into the bypass tunnel. You see the physics of their genius in real time. The threat gets neutralized not by stopping the water, but by giving it a new path, an obedient path. These simulations let archaeologists test theories that used to be pure guesswork. What was the flow rate in the main aqueduct from the spring of Moses? You input the channel's dimensions, its meticulously surveyed gradient, and the software calculates the speed, the pressure. They can test if that pressure was enough to feed a second-story fountain in the royal palace. They can model how long it would take to fill the massive cistern beneath the great temple from a single storm. This isn't just animation for show, it's a rigorous tool. A researcher might think a particular sluice gate was used to prioritize irrigation for the terraced farms in spring. The digital model can run that scenario. It shows how diverting water there would affect levels in the urban reservoirs. It reveals the trade-offs, the balances the Nabataean water magistrates had to manage. For us, these reconstructions complete a picture our eyes can't see. We stand in the Sick today and see a dry, majestic crack in the earth. The digital model lets us see it as the Nabataeans did. A shimmering ribbon of water flowing steadily along the cliff wall, its gentle sound echoing in that narrow space. You can watch reservoirs fill from the bottom up. Cool, dark water rising against the stone. You can see the public nymphaeum come alive, water cascading over its sculpted facade, mist cooling the air of the colonnaded street. This visualization breathes life back into inert stone. It turns a collection of clever ruins into a living, pulsing organism. The city's heartbeat, its water becomes visible again. It lets us comprehend the scale of their achievement not as an abstract idea, but as a tangible, flowing reality. We're not just looking at what they built. We're witnessing what they made happen, and in that digital flow, we come closer than ever to walking the streets of Petra in its prime, to hearing the sound that meant security, prosperity, life itself. The water flowing through the Sick, it wasn't just a utility, it was a kind of hymn. For the Nabataeans, engineering and the sacred, that line wasn't blurred. It never existed. Water wasn't just a physical resource to manage, it was a divine gift, a manifestation of cosmic order. That spiritual dimension infused their entire hydraulic system. Practical channels became sacred conduits. Their supreme deity was Dashara, the god of the mountains, and a mountain in the desert, it's not just rock. It's the source, the high places where clouds gather, where springs emerge from deep within the stone. To control the water flowing from Dashara's domain was to mediate a sacred power. It gave their technical mastery a spiritual mandate. The king or high priest overseeing the water system wasn't just an administrator, he was a custodian. A keeper of a holy trust. That belief wove their technology into the fabric of faith, into the community. You see this fusion at their sacred sites, the Garden Temple complex. Archaeologists didn't just find an altar there, they found an engineered water garden, channels feeding pools and basins inside a walled courtyard. This wasn't for irrigation. It was for ritual, the sound of trickling water, the sight of its reflective surface in a sun-baked space that created an experience of abundance, of divine presence. To stand there was to be in a microcosm, a paradise the gods could provide, a theological statement built in stone and water, then the processional way to the great high place. The main open-air sanctuary on a mountaintop, that path was lined with channels, with small basins. Pilgrims ascending for rites would have had water guiding their path. Purifying their journey, at the summit itself, near the altars, they found carved basins, cisterns. Water was essential for the libations, for the cleansing ceremonies under the open sky. Connecting the offerings to the very element that sustained life below, this integration had a social purpose, a political one. The public display of water in sacred spaces underscored the ruler's divine mandate. It showed visually that the king, through his engineers and priests, could reliably deliver the god's most precious blessing. A functioning nymphaeum next to a temple wasn't just convenient. It was proof of favored status. Community gratitude for water was directed through religious observance that reinforced social cohesion. Maintaining the system became an act of collective piety. Cleaning a public channel, contributing to a temple cistern, that was service to the city and to the gods. In this way, the Nabataeans did something rare. They kept their greatest achievement from becoming a point of conflict, a tool for pure oppression. By sanctifying the source and the distribution, they framed water management as a sacred covenant. The technology itself became worship. The gentle gradient of an aqueduct was an act of devotion. The impermeable lining of a cistern was an act of preservation for a holy substance. That mindset may have been the ultimate source of their system's resilience. It's one thing to neglect a broken pipe, it's another to neglect a sacred duty. Their legacy whispers that the most sustainable systems are those that are cherished, not just used, that the deepest engineering respects not only the physics of a resource, but also its meaning to the human spirit. The awe Petra inspires can lead to stories that get ahead of the facts. There's a persistent myth about a single secret water source, a hidden spring known only to them that fed the entire city. It's a romantic idea, but archaeology shows something different and more interesting. There was no single secret, there were dozens. The genius was in the multiplicity. The sacred spring of Moses gave a steady, reliable baseline, but the flash flood capture from the high plateaus supplied the real volume. Hundreds of cisterns, public and private, stored it, and countless smaller springs and seeps in the hills were tapped and channeled in. Their strategy was the opposite of putting all their eggs in one basket. It was about creating a resilient web, a distributed system. This wasn't a secret, it was a public, engineered reality. It meant the failure of one source, even a major one, didn't mean catastrophe. The system could adapt. That's more impressive than any hidden well. Another oversimplification is total self-sufficiency. We imagine Petra as a sealed oasis, cut off, surviving solely on its own water and terraced farms. That isn't quite accurate. Correcting it doesn't diminish their achievement, it refines it. Petra was first a trading empire. Its wealth came from the flow of incense and spices across the desert. That trade brought in materials, ideas, and additional resources. Their agriculture was remarkably productive, but feeding a dense urban population in that environment was always a challenge. They likely imported supplemental grain from more fertile regions, using their trade wealth. Their water system didn't create a closed bubble. It created the stable, luxurious base from which their commercial network could operate. The water mastery enabled the trade, and the trade funded the water mastery. They weren't isolated, they were brilliantly connected. Their hydraulic system was the bedrock of that connection. We have to be careful with scale, too. It's easy to imagine the cisterns as bottomless, holding years of water. The reality, while astounding, had hard limits. Modern models, based on cistern capacity and estimated ancient rainfall, give a clearer picture. The system was designed for seasonal cycling. The cisterns were meant to be filled by winter rains and drawn down over the long, dry summer and autumn. They provided a buffer of months, not years. A succession of drought years would have placed severe strain on the city, requiring rationing, prioritization, and perhaps reliance on that wider trade network for survival. This doesn't show a weakness, it shows a sophisticated understanding of carrying capacity. They engineered for the probable, not the impossible. Their system was sustainable because it was calibrated to the actual rhythms of their environment, not a fantasy of endless abundance. Dispelling these myths doesn't shrink the Nabataean accomplishment, it enlarges it with truth. They weren't magicians with a single secret. They were pragmatic engineers who built redundancy into every step. They weren't a hermit kingdom. They were a commercial hub that used environmental wisdom to secure its position. They didn't conquer the desert's limits. They danced with them, designing a life that flourished within them. This realistic view is more inspiring. It shows a civilization that triumphed not through supernatural means, but through observation, innovation, and a deep, respectful collaboration with the very constraints of their world. Their legacy isn't a fairy tale, it's a masterclass in sustainable adaptation, and that raises a final question. If they were so attuned, so resilient, what subtle shifts finally tipped the balance from adaptation to retreat? What were the whispers the desert made that even they, in the end, could not answer? The names are gone. The work is still here. We look at the aqueducts, the empty cisterns, and we ask who? Who were the people who turned a desert's whisper into a city's lifeline? In Rome, you had engineers like Vitruvius. They wrote books, they left their names. The Nabataean masters are anonymous. Their legacy isn't in signed stones, it's in the perfect slope of a channel, the waterproof seal of a reservoir, the unerring logic of a diversion wall. To understand them, you have to read their work, and it tells you they weren't a single genius, they were a lineage. A craft that was passed down. Their training would have been rigorous, but not in a school. It was an apprenticeship of observation. A young person, probably from a family already in the work, would follow a master. They'd walk the wadis after a flood. They'd learn to read the water's story in the silt that was left behind. They'd feel the gradient of a channel with their feet. They'd understand how a slope too steep would cause erosion, too shallow, and the water would just sit. They'd mix the hammer plaster. They'd learn the exact consistency of lime and crushed pottery that made it hold water. This knowledge was held in the hands, in the eyes, in a practiced intuition for how water and stone behave. It was empirical science, refined over generations of trial and error and success. Their knowledge was a fusion. First, a deep understanding of hydrology. They knew their local water cycle intimately, which high plateaus fed which canyons. How long after a storm upstream a flood would appear at the entrance to the sick. Second, practical geometry. Surveying those miles of channels required a method for a consistent, gentle drop. They likely used simple tools, water levels maybe, sightings along aligned poles. They could take a concept of a slope and translate it into a physical cut across a cliff face. With astonishing accuracy. Third, and fundamentally, they drew on the inherited wisdom of their nomadic past. That ancestral knowledge of finding water in a barren landscape, of reading subtle signs in the terrain, that informed their grandest designs. the great catchment of the Petra basin itself, that was a nomadic principle, scaled up to a monumental size. So what was their place in society? Were they priests, artisans, a unique class of their own? Water was sacred in Nabataean culture. That suggests a strong link to the temple. The chief watermaster may have held a priestly title, mediating between the technical and the divine. He would have advised the king on water allocations. His authority backed by a spiritual mandate, but the day-to-day work, the carving, the plastering, the maintenance, that fell to skilled artisans, stonemasons, channel cutters, plasterers. These were highly respected craftspeople. Their guilds protected specialized knowledge. Their status was significant. The health of the city literally flowed through their hands. To think about these unknown masters is to shift your perspective. You move from marveling at a static monument to honoring a dynamic process. The Petra water system wasn't invented in one brilliant moment. It was an iterative innovation, a slow, collective intelligence at work over centuries. A grandfather's observation about a spring's flow would inform a father's design for a new aqueduct, which a son would later expand to meet a growing neighborhood's needs. Each generation built on the last, refining, adapting, improving. It's a humbling reminder. Great engineering is often a cultural achievement. It's the product of a society that values certain kinds of knowledge, that organizes itself to sustain that knowledge, that patiently invests in long-term stewardship. The anonymous Nabataean engineer represents not a forgotten individual, but a thriving intellectual tradition. One that listened to the land, learned from its rhythms, and left behind not a name but a testament to what human collaboration with nature can build. Their silence asks us to look past the myth of the lone genius, to see in Petra's flowing legacy the work of countless hands and the wisdom of an entire civilization. There's another city around Petra, a quieter one. It's not carved into facades, it's etched right into the skin of the land. Walking these canyons now, you're walking through the blueprint of an empire that worked. If you know how to look, the landscape starts to speak, not in the language of kings, in the grammar of capture and flow and storage. You have to learn to read the subtle marks, the ones most people just walk past. Start by looking up. High on a cliff, you might see a dark opening, perfectly round. It looks too deliberate to be natural. That's a cistern mouth, carved to reach a chamber hollowed inside the rock. They placed them high to catch rain from the plateau above, or to take water channeled from even higher up. Their placement is never an accident. Each one is a node in the network, a savings account in the stone. You find them alone and in clusters. A neighborhood's worth of private water, invisible from the ground. Then trace the lines on the smooth walls of the sick, and along smaller wadis you'll see a shallow groove. Sometimes it's just a shadow, a clean, straight incision running for hundreds of feet. That's a water channel. Follow it with your eyes. See how it keeps a relentless, gentle descent, how it takes a corner with a smooth curve made to slow the turbulence. In places, it's covered with flat stone slabs to shield the water from sun and wind. These lines were the empire's arteries, faint now, but once they thrummed. They turned a geological formation into a piece of precise machinery. Leave the main canyon, climb to the plateaus around it. Here, the story shifts. From urban supply to food, the ground is littered with lines of stone, low walls now tumbled and half buried. They run along the contours of the slopes. Like steps on a giant staircase, these are the agricultural terraces. Their logic is beautiful in its simplicity. Each wall creates a flat bench. It catches soil that would wash away. More than that, it forces the rare rain to pause, to soak in, to feed the roots of vines and olive trees that once grew here. From a distance, they look like natural rock. Up close, you see the handiwork, stones fitted carefully without mortar to last seasons. They turned barren hillsides into productive farms, a green halo around the rose-red city. Maybe the most profound marks are the ones of absence, the wide, flat basins carved into bedrock at the head of a wadi. They look like empty swimming pools now. These are the settling basins. Their silent, spacious floors were where the furious flood first lost its speed, where the desert silt settled out, leaving clearer water to flow on. Standing in one, you can almost feel the engineered calm, the deliberate stillness imposed on chaos. These features aren't ruins in the dramatic sense. They're tools worn smooth by use, not just by time. The channel's groove is deepest where the water ran for centuries. The cistern mouth's edges are rounded by the touch of countless hands lowering jars. The terrace walls are slumped not just from collapse but from the weight of soil they once held. They're artifacts of process, of daily, seasonal, generational labor. That's the true monument, not a single tomb or temple, but a transformed landscape. The Nabataeans didn't just build in the desert, they reprogrammed it. They inscribed a new set of instructions onto its surface, instructions for how to live and thrive in a place of scarcity. When the people left, the instructions remained. A permanent imprint, a story told not in words but in the shape of the stone, the path of a groove, the logic of a wall on a hillside. It's a story of a dialogue so profound that when the human voice fell silent, the desert kept the record. In these silent, functional marks, you see the empire's enduring signature. It asks you to reconsider what makes a civilization great. Is it the gold in its tombs or the water in its cisterns? The grandeur of its palaces or the patience of its terraces? The landscape around Petra votes quietly but insistently for the latter. Petra's real monument was its purpose. It was an empire built on water, carved right into the stone, a civilization that saw its biggest problem as its only answer. The Nabataeans didn't conquer the desert. They talked to it, they learned the language of scarcity, and they spoke back with channels and cisterns and basins that slowed the water down. Their legacy is about resilience. Sustainability isn't a place you arrive at, it's a conversation. It's watching first, then adapting. It's following a landscape's own logic, not fighting its limits. Take the big diversion dam. It just turned a flood's force, or the thousands of hidden cisterns, saving that water for the dry season. Each piece was a response. An answer to a harsh question. They built a closed loop. Rain became a flash flood, then a managed stream, then a stored reserve, then irrigation for terraced farms. Then food for a city that controlled the trade routes. It was a perfect circle, a hydraulic civilization where political power and spiritual belief and technical skill all flowed in the same channel. That balance held for centuries. It let a grand city rise from a rock canyon. It let gardens grow where there should have been only dust. It let the sound of fountains echo where there should have been just wind. It makes you look at our own world, our own resource and climate challenges. The scale is different, but the principles are the same. The Nabataean model favors distributed systems, not centralized ones. It favors catching abundance when it comes, not assuming it's always there. It favors designing for the extreme, not the average. And most of all, it favors deep local knowledge. Really knowing a place, Petra's silent channels aren't just an archaeological wonder. They're a mirror. They show a choice we all face. Do we see our environment as an adversary to dominate or a partner to understand? The desert bloomed once because a people chose to listen. They learned the rhythm of the water and built their lives to its beat. That rhythm is still there in the stone. A timeless pulse, a reminder that human ingenuity with some humility can do something lasting. It can make an empire from a whisper.